Today's episode takes us back to the summer of 1892 in Fall River, Massachusetts, where the heat wasn't the only thing driving people mad. Picture this: Lizzie Borden, a well-behaved church-going daughter living in a house divided, literally, where the staircase on one side leads to her father and stepmother's bedroom and the other side leads to hers. The Bordens are an odd bunch. They've got more money than they know what to do with, yet they're living in a house with no indoor plumbing. Even as Andrew Borden hoards his wealth like some kind of Victorian Scrooge, his daughters are stuck fuming over mutton stew that's been left out for far too long. And then the unthinkable happens. On a sweltering August morning, a brutal axe murder leaves Andrew and his wife Abby hacked to death in their own home. And it doesn't take long for the whispers to start. The maid's in shock, the doctor's clueless, and Lizzie's story is changing by the minute. So what drove the wedge deep enough to split this family? And maybe a few skulls wide open. Was it the resentment over their stepmother's inheritance? A mysterious illness that may have been more arsenic than mutton? Or something even darker lurking behind those parlor doors? Today we're peeling back the layers of a case that's fueled speculation for more than a century, sparking nursery rhymes and ghost stories. Was Lizzie Borden the Victorian axe-wielding terror she's been made out to be? Or was there more at play than meets the eye? Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Immortalized for the savage and sickeningly cold killing of her parents, Lizzie Borden has gone down in history as one of the most cruel members America has ever seen. She is the boogeyman, the nightmare that the parents all over the country fear. Only in this case, we know that for Andrew Jackson Borden, it became a brutal reality. Andrew Borden himself was no stranger to hard circumstances and even harder times. Born to a moderately well-off family in 1822, Andrew was left to his own devices and to make his own way in life. He struggled and worked hard for every penny that he made, which led him to becoming a crafty and successful businessman who preferred to save money rather than to spend it. When Lizzie Borden came into the world at Fall River, Massachusetts, just over 10 years after her older sister Emma, she was born to a man who would soon be worth about $10 million in today's money. Where the other wealthy inhabitants of Fall River lived on what was called the Hill, the Bordens lived in the industrial part of town in a house with no indoor plumbing and no trappings to display Andrew's incredible wealth. Before Lizzie's birth, her mother, Sarah Borden, had another daughter she called Baby Alice. Baby Alice died shortly after her birth, and Sarah had been struck by a malicious, mysterious condition. We might call some of the symptoms a result of postpartum depression today. She would often have to spend long periods of time in bed and would frequently lament over baby Alice's fate. Sarah's heartbreak, or her condition, however, did not improve after Lizzie, healthy and hearty, came into the world. Instead, she died only 3 years later of a mysterious condition called uterine congestion. Emma, the oldest child, still a child herself, stepped into the role of being a mother and began looking after Lizzie. She would say decades later that she'd made a promise to their mother before she died and that she would spend the rest of her life looking after baby Lizzie. And for the most part, Emma seemed to do her job really well. Lizzie grew into a conscientious young woman who attended church regularly, even taught immigrant children at Sunday school. On the outside, both Emma and Lizzie were poised, pious, and charitable, the picture of respectable 19th century women. But behind closed doors, another matter entirely. 3 years passed. Andrew married again. Abby Durfee Gray was younger than Andrew and younger than Sarah had been. She was pretty and came from good enough stock to be considered a respectable woman in her own right. But the Borden girls would quickly learn to call a spade a spade. Emma and Lizzie believed that Abby had married their father for one reason and one reason only. Say it with me: money. And soon after Abby stepped into their lives, things began to drastically change. Though he still owned the property that he'd shared with their mother, Andrew bought a new house for his new family. Long and narrow, the new Borden household still lacked all the modern amenities and was focused around a common room. From there, you could go up one flight of stairs and reach Andrew and Abby's bedroom, or you could go up the other on the opposite side of the house and go to the girls'. His new house was literally divided. Tensions only continued to build as the girls grew older. Andrew, still never a man to lavish anyone with expensive gifts, did buy Abby and her sister a house and drove the wedge deeper. Appalled that their stepmother and her family were being given their own properties, while his own daughters were being forced to live with no indoor plumbing, the Borden girls revolted. They demanded that they be allowed to finally live in their own household, and they knew which one of Andrew's existing properties they wanted to be in. Instead of simply making it a gift, however, Andrew sold the house he lived in with Sarah to his daughters for $1. Emma, now around the age of 40, made the controversial decision to move out, even though she was unmarried and had no real means of supporting herself. Lizzie, now close to 30, joined Emma for a while before the pair of them were coaxed back home. They rented rooms at a nearby boarding house before they could be convinced that the family feud was finally over. Emma then decided to move back into her own home, leaving Lizzie to return to the Borden house alone. There, the family maid, Bridget Sullivan, said that Lizzie very rarely interacted with her father or stepmother. They would often eat separately, and Lizzie would later say that she mainly kept to her own room and out of everyone else's way. But that was going to change, and it was going to change quickly. In the blistering and stifling heat of summer in 1892, the Bordens had a pretty unexpected guest. His name was John Morse, and he was Sarah's brother. Emma and Lizzie's uncle rarely visited, but his arrival landed dead center in the middle of the family dispute over properties, including the very same house that his sister had died in. John stayed the night, and on the morning of August 4th, he and Andrew retired to Andrew's study to talk business. The men were in there for over an hour before John left and headed into town to run some errands. Andrew left shortly after that as well, which followed his usual morning routine and would also take him into town to follow up on some of his remaining businesses. That left his wife, 45-year-old Abby, his younger daughter Lizzie, and the maid, Bridget, at the house. And by the time he'd returned later that morning, one of them would be dead. Even though they had a maid, and it was technically Lizzie's chore to do for some reason, Abby decided to clean the guest bedroom. There she was interrupted and turned face to face with someone in the doorway. She was then suddenly struck across her cheek with an axe, stunning the woman and turning her in the air as she fell. Her attacker then began striking again, hitting Abby a total of 17 times in the back of the head. Abby was dead, her body clearly visible from the second-story landing. Around 10:30, a short while after he'd left for town, Andrew returned, not knowing that his own wife was laying on the very floor right above his head. Tired, he then sat on the sofa of the parlor and closed his eyes for a nap. It was then that he was struck across the face with an axe, slicing one of his eyes clean in two. His attacker struck again and again, killing Andrew before he had a chance to fight back. According to their own accounts, it was about 13 minutes later that Lizzie discovered her father's body. She claimed that she'd been outside in the barn and had come back in to find her father laying there. "Come quick," she shouted for Bridget. "Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Bridget, who said that she'd been in her own room resting, then came rushing, only to be sent across the street to the family physician, Dr. Bowen. Dr. Bowen arrived on the scene and declared Andrew dead. No one at this point had ventured upstairs. No one had gone even later when the police arrived to begin their investigation. It was only when one of Lizzie's and Emma's friends and neighbors came over to help keep the women company that Abby's remains were found. Lizzie explained that she had not gone looking for Abby because she believed that Abby had gone to visit one of her relatives that morning. A panic gripped the town. One of the most affluent and successful businessmen had been attacked and killed in his own home. Worse still, his respectable wife had been murdered right along with him. There was no telling where the killer would strike next, and no knowing how high their victim count would rise. The Fall River police found themselves buckling under the mounting pressure to solve the case and find the person responsible. And it was shortly after that the community divided. While others blamed a mysterious, disgruntled Portuguese worker, others placed the blame far closer to the Borden family home. The house itself had no signs of break-in or struggle, which begged a simple question. What if one of the two women already inside the house had been the killer? What if it had been Lizzie Borden herself? The Bordens had collectively suffered from food poisoning about a week before the murders. The same doctor, Dr. Bowen, had diagnosed them and determined that it had come from mutton and that it had been left out for far too long on the stove. But what if, instead of food poisoning, their mysterious sickness had just been a case of actual poisoning? Lizzie had actually been purchasing a well-known poison from the chemist earlier that week, claiming that she was going to clean a cloak with it. And you know how the story goes. Andrew Borden is now dead. Lizzie hit him on the head. Up in heaven he will sing. On the gallows she will swing. At trial, the prosecution laid out a dazzling case of circumstantial evidence that painted Lizzie a cold and callous killer who'd been after one thing and one thing only, Andrew's money. The defense put forth understated but devastating clever rebuttals. How could it be possible that Lizzie would have had time to kill Andrew and be seen by witnesses only 13 minutes later in a clean dress with no blood spatter on her? How could her own statements be admissible in court when she'd given them under the influence of morphine and without her lawyers being present? Why was her purchase of poison relevant to the trial when she could have very well been using it to clean her cloak? After about an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury agreed with the defense and acquitted Lizzie of all charges. She and Emma then inherited their father's substantial estate, and they built a new life for themselves. They finally moved to an enormous property on the hill. Lizzie then changed her name to Lisbeth and began patroning the local theaters. She surrounded herself with actresses, artists, and creatives, and she distanced herself from Emma. Unable to keep up with her sister's new lavish lifestyle, Emma moved out and never saw Lizzie again. But maybe stranger still, in 1927, the two Borden daughters, still estranged, died just days after each other. Lizzie went first after battling complications with her gallbladder and pneumonia. Emma quickly followed after suffering from several kidney conditions. They were buried together on the family plot in Oak Grove Cemetery, right next to their parents. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast today. Not enough time to really fill in some of the theories of what people over the years have thought about Lizzie Borden and the killing of her father and stepmother. I will quickly tell you a couple of those theories. I'm not going to go into big detail about it, but I will tell you what they are. The main one probably is that Lizzie Borden was a lesbian, and she was together with the maid, and that Abby walked in, found out what was going on, one thing led to another, and what happened. There are many people that believe that. Also, they think that possibly Lizzie was the victim of physical and sexual abuse by her father, and that's what prompted her to do what she did. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but those are a couple of the bigger theories when I read up on this case that people think might have been the reason for it. And I'll be honest, knowing about this story before I did any deep dive research on it, I assumed, because I'd always heard about the mutton that was old and spoiled and was making them all sick, I don't know why, I just assumed that had something to do, because you always hear about that when it comes to this case. I assumed that it kind of made her crazy, like there was some kind of toxin in there that made her crazy and she snapped and possibly did this, but I didn't really see that in what I read. So who knows? It's a very interesting story, and thank you for taking the time to listen to it today. If you've got anything that you want to talk to me about, any story suggestions, questions, comments, anything like that, you can go to 10minutemurder.com. There you'll find my email, you'll find a blog, and all kinds of other things. And that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you for listening to 10 Minute Murder.